Okay, so I think it's 11:35, so I'm gonna proceed to start this. Thank you everybody for coming. My name is Matias Ornengo. I'm founder, co-editor of the Review of Keynesian Economics, who sponsors the now 8th Godley-Tobin Lecture. I first of all want to thank the Eastern Economic Association and Alex Olbrecht. He's not here, but there are some members of the board for always hosting us and being very generous. Also to Edward Elder that publishes the Review of Keynesian Economics. And before I present you, Professor DeLong, which doesn't need much presentation, let me say very briefly what's the purpose of the Godley-Tobin lecture. So the idea of the Godley-Tobin lecture, the idea of the journal, I should say, was created in conversations with Louis-Philippe Rochon, and the idea of having an alternative journal, but coalesced with conversations with Tom Paley about the need for, in the aftermath of the 2008-9 crisis, of reconfiguration, a return, a rebuilding of an old Keynesian consensus that had existed prior to the crisis of the 1970s. And in a sense, the Godley-Tobin lecture is a culmination of that idea. Hence, I should say, the little stories. Jim Tobin came to give a talk at the New School. He said that he was a non-hyphenated Keynesian, and when I relayed that story to Win Godley, he said that he was also a non-hyphenated Keynesian. And so, hence, it's the non-hyphenated Review of Keynesian Economics. By the way, non-hyphenated is hyphenated. Not that it matters. But And so Godley and Tobin are somewhat representatives of the kind of alliance that we were thinking. The more conventional mainstream Keynesians of United States, although he wasn't from MIT, but of the saltwater version of Keynesianism of the United States, and Godley that had one of the several strengths of the more heterodox Keynesians of Cambridge, England. That was the basis of the lecture, and it has remained, and we had invited people that are representatives of that sort of consensus, of all consensus, that reintroducing this sort of dialogue. Brad is a perfect professor. Brad DeLong is a representative of that sort of effort, that we want to have this kind of conversation. As I said, you all know he's a professor of economics at UC Berkeley. He got his PhD from undergraduate and PhD from Harvard University. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the Treasury during the Clinton administration, and he has written extensively many papers and more than a few books. The book that I suppose everybody read more recently is his sort of very significant and large global history titled Slouching Towards Utopia, in which he puts upside down the idea of a short 20th century and discusses the long 20th century from 1870 to essentially the 2008-9 crisis. And he puts at the center of that story, I should say, corporations and research labs and stuff like that. The one I want to comment, because I think it's related to the lecture and the ideas of the journal, is his shorter little book called Concrete Economics, Hamiltonian. I won't get the subtitle right, but it's about Hamiltonian policies and how Brad suggests that in the United States there was both a somewhat heterodox tradition in terms that was out of the canon of the traditional sort of views, but also pragmatic in terms of policy, and that was distinctive about what I call the American political economy tradition. And the point of that is that they suggest in that little book that from the 80s, perhaps, I don't know if Brad thinks that, but 2008-9, that's a period that it's eccentric in the American history. These sort of excessive sort of confidence in both free markets and so very orthodox, not heterodox, and also not particularly pragmatic in terms of policies. And that I think aligns perfectly with this idea that there was something slightly heterodox, slightly pragmatic about American economic policy that goes well with the ideas of the review of Keynesian economics. As always, I have spoken too much. I'll go shut up there, and we're in for a treat. So, Professor DeLong.
Thank you very much. One place to start is with one of the cleverest things the very clever Greg Mankiw has said, which is that microeconomists may well have better models, but macroeconomists have much better questions. And so that makes the subject more interesting. Parenthetically, that may well be wrong as we move from the globalized value chain economy that we have finally come to half understand into the attention infobiotech economy of the future that is already here, although not evenly distributed, in which the old arguments that we are by and large doing one-off deviations in microeconomics from markets in which the key good commodity produced and financial flows are associated with largely rival and largely excludable commodities, that may well be passing away, in which case microeconomists will be in the same position that we macroeconomists have always been in. And that is indeed the position that our predecessors were a generation ago, or 2 generations ago, or 3 or 4 or 6. The first of which is that we are studying emergent properties of a very complicated system. And if complexity theory has told us anything, it is that the devil is very, very much in the details. You can get the individual behavior and dynamics and patterns of every single piece making up a complexity theory system exactly right. And if you get the interactions even slightly wrong, the emergent properties will be very, very far away from what a simplified attempt to build things up from micro foundations might once have led you to believe. Moreover, you can't even say, well, gee, we do not understand what the emergent properties, how the emergent properties truly come out of the micro foundations, of the micro behavior, because things are too complicated for us to have anything like an ideal gas law. And indeed, the chemists will tell us that actually trying to derive chemical properties from quantum mechanical underpinnings are, by and large, fairly hopeless. We may well find that not only is the emergence driven by sufficiently simple rules that you actually can build things up, it changes over time. You cannot rely on anything backward-looking to produce significant regularities that hold in a quantitative sense across generations, let alone across a span of time large enough for you to be able to precisely estimate anything. This was hammered home to me enormously back when I was a co-editor of the late great Alan Kruger at the Journal of Economic Perspectives, when we asked Mark Watson and James Stock to actually take a look at the Phillips curve, not as macroeconomists trying to produce something that they could use for forecasting, but rather econometricians who could tell us what we might actually know about some kind of expectational Phillips curve. And the answer was we knew nearly nothing. And even if we could discover something about what was happening during the middle of our sample, we were at the end of our sample and things were drifting away. And so to try to build forecasts, policy projections, reaction functions on it truly was building on sand. And so it is with perhaps every single paper that is going to be published in the American economic journal, Macroeconomics, over the next 5 or over the past 5 years. It will be well done, it will be professional, it will provide genuine insights as to what was happening in the sample and with the data. But it will be of very little use to people trying to figure out what macroeconomic policy should be over the next 5, let alone 10, 15, or 20 years. That attempting to go beyond the rules of thumb that central banks adopt and adapt as they try to push themselves forward into the future with their mission is indeed to building on sand. So can we go back and say anything at all? I don't know, but I decided we would try to go back to first principles and try to see what first principles we could hang on to, and perhaps what those first principles have to tell us about what has been happening over the past 4 years or so, since our emergence from the plague depression. I hope, there it is. I hope that to go through some talk, say in under these 8 headings, starting with the question of, is there indeed anything special and macroeconomic? And going back to the very foundational debate where it was indeed a conclusion reached by pretty much everyone, except for Friedrich von Hayek and his disciples, that yes, indeed, there is something very special and very macroeconomic about this that requires more than simply hands-off. I'm then going to try to outline in kind of 2 steps exactly what those first principles really have to tell us that is in some sense enduring across the now more than 222 years since Jean-Baptiste Say first made the argument for his own initial law back in 1803. Then I'll begin to talk about how we can apply these to the post-COVID plague United States, with a focus on the question of, could the Federal Reserve have done better, and should it have been expected to do better? Could the Biden administration and Congress have done better? And can we reasonably expect them to be better? Reach conclusions about that, and then go on to the very interesting rules about whether indeed stabilization should be our ultimate end. Which leads into the question of, are depression and inflation in some sense useful for the economy? Or even if we do have enough of a handle on first principles to be able to give grounded advice to central banks and others, are our real communicational and political problems themselves so strong that we will be unable, as Glenn Hubbard said last night, we will be unable to listen to even when we have important things to say. If we will be always in the position of, as John Maynard Keynes wrote in the mid-1930s, looking back at his career up until then, always be a croaking Cassandra, understanding exactly what fresh hell is coming down the pike toward us, screaming at the top of our lungs that it needs to be avoided, and having next to no impact, kind of whatsoever. The bottom line, could the Fed have done better post-2000? My conclusion, tentative and quite possibly wrong, is no, is not reasonable. They would have had to foresee at least 2 things that were not foreseeable. Right? The at least temporary end of secular stagnation, as we have known it, of what my colleague Pierre-Olivier Gorenshaw likes to term the safe asset shortage, because secular stagnation was a good selling point line for Alvin Hansen back in the day, but it doesn't really describe the phenomenon. And they would have to foreseen Vladimir Putin, his attack on Ukraine, and its effect on global energy markets without that foreknowledge. The Fed's strategy of we are going to raise interest rates late and fast in this particular business cycle was a prudent purchase of insurance against eventualities that turned out not to be the case, not to come to pass, but could well have come to pass. A prudent purchase of insurance given uncertainties back at the start of 2001. Could the Biden administration and Congress have done better in 2001? Maybe, but when congressional action is extremely difficult, to try to wait and see for more information itself forecloses a great many potential possibilities. That optionality is really not the thing, given how complicated and arcane and baroque the orrery of our political system is. So, is there anything special requiring macroeconomic, requiring public sector attention? Well, Jean-Baptiste Say started out in 1803 saying no. Thomas Malthus responded a decade later saying yes. 2.5 decades after he originally wrote, Jean-Baptiste Say was definitely saying yes. John Stuart Mill concurred in saying yes in 1829 and actually brought some conceptual clarity to the problem. And Walter Bagehot, much later in the century, pointed out a very particular and peculiar financial dimension to the problem, which John Maynard Keynes in the 1920s and 1930s then tried to very powerfully enforce. But let's start with Jean-Baptiste Say, in 1803. He'd started out as a young French Enlightenment progressive, special assistant to various people who wanted to be high politicians in the new French Republic. Found that various of his patrons had been suddenly fired, arrested, imprisoned, and then guillotined. Decided that the game of French politics and government was played with tools that were too sharp. Said, I am going to go back home and write books instead. Which he did for the rest of his life, save for 1 year when Napoleon convinced him that he wanted to come on to some advisory council or other during the consulate. But other than that, decided that he was going to be a semi-academic scribbler, rather than attempt to deal with the madmen in authority. And in 1803, he argued that to say that there was something particularly macroeconomic going on with a market economy was to mistake the means for the cause. An error that proceeds from the circumstance that you find yourself confused by the veil of money overpinning the economy, while actually it was exchange of commodities for commodities that was the fundamental underlying value. Hence, there is always enough money to conduct the circulation and mutual interchange of other values when those values really exist. And should the increase of traffic require more money to facilitate it, the want is very easily supplied because merchants and bankers are very good at figuring out how to greatly take any reserve base and multiply the amount of inside money that could actually be used for cash and on the barrel exchange, almost without limit. That was, say, in 1803. By 1819, Thomas Robert Malthus was protesting that did not seem to work. That he was looking at an industrial sector of the Northwest European economies in 1819, 4 years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, 4 years after the last major shock that you might argue deranged the state of the economy and produced a large excess supply in some sectors as demand shifted in different directions. And so by Walras law, you had excess supply in some places, which must imply excess demand in others if the market is working well. And it is a tenet of the new doctrine, by which he meant Ricardo and Say on profits and demand, that if one trade be overstocked with capital, i.e. with demand, it is a certain sign that some other trade is understocked. But where, I would ask, is there any considerable trade that is confessedly understocked? and where high profits have long been in vain for additional capital? Where is the excess demand for some form of commodities there to balance the excess supply we see in the depressed sectors of the post-Napoleonic economy? The war has now been at an end about 4 years, and although the removal of capital from one sector to another generally occasions some partial loss, yet it is seldom long in taking place if it be tempted to remove by great demand and by high profits. And by 1829, having watched the British textile, canal-driven financial crisis of 1825, Jean-Baptiste Say agreed with Malthus. He talks about the financial crisis of 1825 in almost Minskian terms. And his concluding paragraph describing the crisis and the subsequent depression is that business assets could not be sold at any price. As every type of merchandise had sunk below its costs of production, a multitude of workers were without work. Many bankruptcies were declared among merchants and among bankers who, having placed more bills in circulation than their personal wealth could cover, could no longer find guarantees to cover their issues beyond the undertakings of individuals, many of whom had themselves become bankrupt. The exact opposite of a belief in something like Say's law, from Jean-Baptiste Say himself, come 1829. And writing at the same time, John Stuart Mill really put his finger on at least one way of conceptualizing the problem. I think the way that fundamentally underpins everything we do and think when we start by saying that macroeconomics is important in a monetary economy. Writing that those who have affirmed that there could be a general glut, an excess of all commodities, never pretended that money was one of those commodities. What it amounted to was that persons in general at that particular time, from a general expectation of being called upon to meet sudden demands, liked better to possess money than any other commodity. Money, consequently, was in request, and all other commodities were in comparative disrepute. When this happens to one single commodity, there is said to be an excess supply of that commodity, and if that be a proper expression, there would seem to be in the nature of the case no particular impropriety in saying that there is an excess supply of all or most commodities when all or most of them are in this same predicament. We would say Walras law, excess demand or excess supply of money, excess supply or excess demand of pretty much everything else of currently produced commodities and of labor. I think that is the fundamental principle of stabilization policy. That for whatever reason, Say's law is false in theory, and thus there is a powerful role for a government to try to make it true in practice. With an extra wrinkle added by Walter Bagehot in his Lombard Street, attempting to figure out what was going on, what rules the Bank of England had evolved in the mid-1800s to figure out how to deal with the commercial crises and depressions that came semi-regularly through mid-century England. And coming up with with Bagehot's rule, which is that in a financial crisis, the central bank has to lend freely at a penalty rate on collateral at the normal times in order to inflate the actual reserve stock in the hands of the banking system in order to cure the excess demand for money out there in the economy, both through increasing the money stock and also through decreasing money demand by making people confident that they will not be caught out, that there actually will be a way for them to get additional cash, to dump assets for cash, if they truly, truly indeed need it. That also, I think, is one of the first principles. And of course, there is, as Keynes wrote in his 1923 tract on monetary reform, there is the flip side of this. That in addition to depression and mass unemployment, you have inflation, rising prices, both of which have their characteristic disadvantage. Inflation means injustice to individuals and classes, creates additional risk, it is unfavorable to saving. Deflation and depression mean impoverishment to labor and to enterprise, and are disastrous, for employment. We need to try to find a balance, and that is why John Maynard Keynes dedicated his tract on monetary reform to the governor and the court of the Bank of England, who were in the post-World War I situation facing a much more unstable situation than they ever had before, and yet had much greater demands pushed upon them. Moreover, there is the second order problem, that the market economy, when it works, and it works well enough, Keynes said that being in accord with human nature, it has great advantages, at least to those who are not in favor of drastic changes in the existing organization of society, to leave savings to the private investor and setting production in motion to the businessman. But they actually have to do their economic calculations of profitability and of value. And in order to do that, they need to be confident that they are assessing what market values are properly, and those market values are not going to change underneath them and produce enormous amounts of additional unnecessary risk. Produce instability of the standard of value, Keynes wrote, and you produce unemployment, precarity for the worker, disappointments of expectations, losses of savings, excessive windfalls, speculators, profiteers, all proceeding in large measure from the instability of value. And from these great causes, we must free ourselves from deep distrust of having the government engage in, call it light-fingered, light-handed, minor, light-touch central planning. No longer leave the regulation of the standard of value to chance and circumstance, but instead make it the subject of deliberate decision by technocrats. Hopefully, technocrats who have been properly educated by Keynes and by his disciples. But when the chips are down, we will take Scott Besant much more above the other likely possible alternatives. The idea that the regulation of the monetary side of the economy is something like the weather, something that happens by natural causes, which we cannot really affect, call it the Hubert Hoover line, or that it's like the birth rate, the resultant of the separate actions of many individuals acting independently, which is not the proper business of the government to interfere with, because catalepsy of some sort, or the Constitution, something so fixed that it requires a revolution to change them. That is an idea, Keynes said, that we need to throw over the side. We need to throw over the side and accept that in our system, at least, that the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board is the closest thing to a central planning organization that our economy has. And it has a mighty responsibility to do the job, to make Say's law true in practice, even though it is false in theory, to make it the case that there is demand for supply, enough, and also supply for demand, enough. Can we go any further? Well, we might try to characterize the kinds of things that go wrong from this macroeconomic stabilization policy principle. And most of them stem from an ambiguity in the idea of what John Stuart Mill meant when he said that money is in request. That there is either an excess demand for or an excess supply of money. You either have people frantically dumping other assets and cutting back on their spending of currently produced goods and services in an attempt to build up their money balances on the one hand, or you have too much money chasing too few goods and people are frantically trying to dump their money balances because they have too much, and yet the system as a whole has no way to get rid of its money balances through win-win exchange. And one, I think, is best well associated with the name of Milton Friedman. It's simply an excess supply-demand of on-the-barrelhead cash. The symptom is we find that people are either buying or dumping currently produced commodities and assets for cash at a frantic and furious rate, producing either inflation or depression with kind of all the knock-on multiplier and accelerator effects of various kinds stemming from that initial disequilibrium. And the cure is monetary policy open market operations to contract or expand the something called the money supply. And Milton Friedman was in some sense the arch Keynesian, believing along with John Maynard Keynes that this was a huge problem. And believing, along with John Maynard Keynes, that a somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment was required in order to deal with this problem. But deviating from Keynes is that Keynes did not believe that monetary policy and open market operations would be enough to do the job, while Friedman was willing to bet his career and his political movement that it would. That all you needed was for the central bank to follow the properly neutral monetary policy. And of course, once you're following a neutral monetary policy, well, you're not interfering in the economy. You're simply enabling the economy. You're simply providing the background infrastructure that, in addition to what you need as property laws, contract laws, and judges to enforce them, you also need a central bank to provide you with a neutral monetary policy. But then in Friedman's framework, there was always this asterisk. What is a neutral monetary policy? The neutral monetary policy is one that produces nearly full employment without undue inflation. How do you know when monetary policy is not neutral? Well, if there is excess unemployment, monetary policy was not neutral. If there is excess inflation, monetary policy was not neutral. Well, but how do you happen to deal with the fact that you can't look back from the future? Originally, Milton Friedman was calling for a K% rule. But does he call for a K% rule for freight car loadings? Or for kilowatt hours generated? Or for retail sales at department stores? Why is the quantity of largely inside assets devoted to providing short-term liquidity services to the banking sector, from the banking sector, why is that quantitative target any more kosher than a freight car loadings or a kilowatt hours target? And Friedman was always evasive on this point. The point was, A, it worked in his and Messelman's past regressions, and B, if it ceased to work, well, then you threw it over the side. The moment that M2 began to become unstable, as M2 velocity had began to become unstable, as Charles Goodhart had warned it that it would be back in the 1960s, were monetarist policy rules adopted, Friedman was eager to throw it over the side and say that the Bank of Japan, was following a clearly constrictive monetary policy, precisely because aggregate demand was not behaving even though the monetary aggregates were. I think upon this conflation of a laissez-faire government non-interference policy with a neutral monetary policy with whatever works, upon that, I think, hinges a great many of the intellectual confusion that I have watched throughout most of my career on issues of macroeconomics. And, Uncle Milton was a very smart man and won a huge amount of debates, but I am happy to blame him for this. But there are other kinds. There are other kinds of excess supply and demands of, quote, money, unquote, than just an excess supply demand of on-the-barrelhead cash that you see in the movement of interest rates, constant movement of interest rates all along the duration spectrum. A second is what you might call the Keynesian. The Keynesian kind of excess supply and demand, the Keynesian depression or inflation. The problem is not an excess supply and demand of cash on the barrelhead cash, but rather an excess supply or demand for liquid assets considered as savings investment vehicles. With the symptom being asset values high or low in spite of interest rates that are also high or low. And the cure being fiscal or investment regulation policy to contract or expand the stock of savings vehicles. And then there is third, the thing that we saw twice, the thing we saw in 1931-33, and then most prominently in 2008 and 2009, when you have an excess supply and demand not so much of on-the-barrelhead cash, and not so much of the total value of assets regarded as savings investment vehicles, but rather an excess supply of assets considered safe and collateralizable. And the symptom is that safe reserve assets go to an extraordinary discount or premium relative to anything else. That either the fiscal theory of the price level comes out and starts to dance, on the one hand, or on the other hand, the reserve asset of the system goes to a sharp premium as everything else kind of collapses in value, as we saw in 1932 and 2008. The cure for this, I think, remains not completely clear. Most of the things that you think of that might be a cure run the risk of cracking the status of various things as safe collateralizable assets. Because in the end, those depend on a political economy of a government willing to tax to make them good, rather than try to inflate them away or rather than try to soak them up. And that is hard to guarantee from the perspective of any economic policymaker. That rests at a deeper level. And then there are the interactions of all these things. Something that I think should be associated with the name of Robert Gordon, who I think wound up doing a huge amount of work that ought to have stood the test of time in the 1970s in figuring out nearly in real time what the actual consequences of supply shocks are of large discrete relative price movements in individual sectors that nevertheless have substantial macroeconomic implications, for which it is still not clear what the real cure is going to be. I think that is what we know. I think that is all pretty much of what we know. I think we still can make not too terrible forecasts of the likely future of economic activity. But I think the reason we can do those is largely for the reasons that Christopher Sims pointed out nearly a generation ago, which is that even a bad model can forecast very well as long as it is flexible enough to incorporate a value of var inside of it. Incorporate a var inside of it, it will be pretty good at forecasting for a constant economic structure. But try to use that from which to derive serious counterfactual predictions about policies are going to be at a quantitative level. You are asking for truly serious trouble. So given that, we then have rules of thumb derived from central banking experience, with central banks well aware that the structure is shifting underneath them, And that, as Alan Blinder still likes to say, the best you wind up doing is essentially a one data point regression from the last business cycle, and a hope that the underlying structure has not changed too fast, so that your previous one data point the one data point regression, even though its notional standard errors are infinite, still at least gets you close to where the mean is. Given that, what can we say has happened since the start of 2001? Well, the first thing that has to impress you is the enormous transatlantic inflation consonance. Whether you look at the harmonized index of consumer prices for the European Union, whether you look at the harmonized index of consumer prices for the United States, whether you look at the CPI for all urban consumers for the United States. The key things to look at are exactly how similar they are, with the US CPI be lagging behind the others in their estimate of how large the inflation outburst was, before settling now at a rather higher rate than the harmonized indexes call, as things happening in the real estate sector continue to have a higher weight in the CPI than they do in the harmonized indexes. It is a common thing, and it is not a common thing in the sense that you could say that the Great Depression or the Great Recession were a common thing, but they had the origins in the United States. Instead, this has its origins much more broadly. And so while you could say that the Federal Reserve could have driven the world economy as a whole to a different outcome in the Great Depression and the Great Recession, it is much harder to say that the Fed was more than just along for the ride in this most recent episode. We also have in the United States, excess inflation being over, as of May 2023. As Paul Krugman liked to tweet out, the eagle has soft landed, right? And the eagle soft landed remarkably quickly for anyone whose background model of this thing was an expectational inflationary spiral in which expectations of future inflation become adaptive and then sit themselves into the structure of the economy and have to be wrung out, by high interest rates. That yes, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates fast when it did decide to raise them, but significantly before you could have expected, even with short and not very variable lags, for those interest rate increases to have had sufficient effects on exchange rates and on construction decisions to materially affect the economy and the state of aggregate demand. Even before you could have hoped that the Federal Reserve's interest rate increases would have had any materially significant effects on the economy, the excess inflation was all but gone. And maybe you have an issue about the last percentage point or so, and maybe not. But all but that is gone, by May 2023. And throughout, the market really believes that Jay Powell has this almost rock solid 5-year forward market-based inflation expectations throughout, with I think one teeny spike in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when the five-year implicit break-even inflation rate has a spike of 0.3 percentage points, that people thinking that from 5 to 10 years out, inflation is going to be 0.6 percentage points higher than its rock solid expected mean. The current inflation heralds higher future inflation train never got out of the station, at least as far as the implicit values in the bond market. as set by all the people frantically around here punching keys on their computer screens. Did. Does that really matter, right? Are there sets of expectations elsewhere that do not feed into people in financial markets? Might it be the case that workers or suppliers or businesses actually did expect higher inflation because they key off of credit card rates or gasoline prices or wherever? I have seen that argument made. I have not seen that argument really justified. Yes, on the one hand, taking the gaps between tips and nominal treasury securities as your guiding star here places more weight on the efficient market hypothesis than I would really like to place. It certainly places more weight on the efficient market hypothesis. If you're using the efficient market hypothesis to try to forecast what reality out there is going to be. But in this case, we're using the efficient market hypothesis to try to see what the expectations of the traders are. And in that, the EMH is on a much higher, sounder ground. Because if people's decisions about what to buy and sell do not tell you what they're thinking, it's hard to tell you what possibly would. So, at least tentatively, I want to conclude that the 1970s expectation, inflation adaptive expectation spiral simply never appeared. In some sense, this is great credit to Paul Volcker and confirmation of the fact that his policies in the end were worth pursuing, that by putting the economy through hell in the early 1980s, he did indeed purchase a treasure of great price, which is confidence that the Federal Reserve takes its inflation-fighting mission seriously. And with people confident that the Federal Reserve takes its inflation-fighting mission seriously, the Fed then gains enormous ability to conduct monetary policy on the basis of what is optimal now without considering what its effect on future expectations will be. Because current actions do not carry any message that the Federal Reserve might be deviating from some overall inflation control mandate. And almost rock-solid five-year forward market-based inflation expectations, even though with a slight wavering of market confidence with inflation control with Putin, even though the Fed moved late. Right? The Fed only started to move a year before the inflation wave was over. And when it did move very fast. Looking at the 10-year tips, which seems to be a convenient single thing to look at most, the Fed's policy changes and talk pushed the tips rate up by 250 basis points in the span of 6 months, and then pushed it up by another 50 basis points in the middle of 2023, after the end of the inflation, moved late and fast. As opposed to people with the actual increases, with half of the actual increases coming after, in federal funds rate coming after, the new constant long-term inflation, long-term interest rate, the interest rate that actually matters for exchange rates and for construction, and thus for net exports and for the housing and building sector, the things that the Federal Reserve can actually expect, that the second half of the interest rate increases were simply the Fed validating what people had already concluded that its policy was. But practically every single naive linear model, right? Every single naive linear model says that the Federal Reserve raised interest rates too late, that it should have been raising them much earlier, and should have been raising them much more slowly, much more gradually. Of course, every single other naive linear model does not really incorporate the fact that there is a zero lower bound on nominal interest rates, at least given our current institutions. and tells us that it ought to have pushed nominal interest rates way, way low to things like minus 8% in the original Taylor 1993, early in 2000 as the COVID plague hit. And this absence of any serious consideration of the zero lower bound makes simply saying that you ought to be tracking some kind of linear Taylor rule, makes that by and large very much the wrong thing to say. Because it does seem to be a fact that the Federal Reserve loses a lot of traction when you hit the zero lower bound, hence you do not want to be there. Hence, if you have a chance, you wish to purchase insurance against the possibility of a return to the zero lower bound. And how do you purchase this insurance? Well, you purchase this insurance by moving late, by not starting to raise interest rates until the chance that you will return to the zero lower bound and there get stuck. Until that chance has dropped so low that it is no longer a major optionality factor entering into your cost-benefit calculations. And indeed, inflation was indeed transitory. Only transitory was much longer and stronger than the great and good, including me, had expected. That the supply chain and reopening shocks turned out to have had much larger price side effects than I at least had anticipated. And then they were amplified by the Putin shock, which was also transitory, and also did not ever get embedded in expectations of future inflation. And so, I think looking back, I was right in saying the Federal Reserve should move late. And then when the Federal Reserve did move, I was alarmed that it was moving so fast. I thought it was overdoing it. And indeed, the Federal Reserve's moving fast did not have an effect on the economy until after U.S. inflation had come down to near normal. But then the raising of interest rates by about twice as much as my back-of-the-envelope sense had made me think they ought to be, it did not send the economy into recession. The neutral interest rate of Newton-Vixel, which was brought back into our discourse by Alan Greenspan in 1993, simply because he felt like it, that neutral rate did indeed seem to have at least temporarily risen substantially, just at the time that all of this else was happening, for reasons that I think still remain obscure, even to the archpriest of the neutral interest rate, the archpriest of R star, our local president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York here. How much of this should we come as a surprise for us? How much should the Federal Reserve have foreseen that transitory was going to be longer than it thought? That these reopening and then Putin shocks were going to be larger than it thought, and then that its substantial increases in interest rates would in fact turn out to be necessary, because a good many of them would be simply mirroring an expected increase in long run R star. How much confidence should the Federal Reserve have had that these three things, deviations from its expectations as it waited and waited and waited until early 2022 to start to move, would come to pass? Well, I think the Federal Reserve should have had no confidence that any of these three things should come to pass. Indeed, I think the Federal Reserve should have had very little confidence in its own consensus-based view of how the economy is working, and should have, as it was, stand ready to change course on a dime and revise things substantially to become massively data dependent, simply because it did not know what the structure of the economy was. That the Federal Reserve had its view that we need very much to avoid getting stuck at the zero lower bound again, and that we face transitory reopening shocks that are going to ebb without receiving much incorporation into any inflation expectation process. And then thinking maybe that's not true, we need to start moving now and we need to move far. But those were both seat-of-the-pants judgments without a great deal of backing. What they instead should have did, and in fact did in practice, was wind up thinking that this might be like any one of the previous 6 inflationary episodes that the United States has experienced since 1900. And of these 6 previous episodes, the 2 1970s episodes are the only 2 in which you have an adaptive expectational mechanism at work. In the World War I episode, yes, the Federal Reserve responded, believed it had to not only deal with inflation, but also to roll back a great deal of the World War I, the post-World War I boom, and then the influenza, then the Spanish influenza supply shock to the economy. And it was always Milton Friedman and Anna J. Schwartz's judgment that in that episode the Fed moved both far too late and far too far, and so caused a massively unnecessary recession. The first major point in the Friedman and Schwartz line that the Fed should have followed, that the Fed's neutral monetary policy ought to have been a constant M2 money stock growth one. In the World War II episode, we had price controls and people were too worried about selling government bonds to even think about raising interest rates. And in the 2 post-World War II and Korean War episodes, monetary policy interest rates were pegged close to the floor by the pre-accord Treasury insistence that the Federal Reserve support Treasury bond prices, given the magnitude of the national debt and the need to sell more of it, to finance first World War II, then post-war reconstruction, and then the great wheeling of the U.S. economy from its post-World War II peacetime back to its Cold War military-industrial complex configuration. In all of these episodes, inflation ebbed naturally, without any requirement for interest rate increases, not even large interest rate increases. And so, as close to benign neglect seems to have been a reasonable judgment, given the span of possibilities, and one that seems to have worked out quite well, that even the Federal Reserve's decision when it did think it was time to move faster and farther than most of us thought, that turned out to be validated afterwards by the fact that housing construction and speculative infotech investment demand turned out to be so strong that the U.S. economy displayed enormous robustness. Nevertheless, episode was unpleasant. The inflation was unpleasant. But I say look at the balance of risks and scenarios as of 2021. What were the chances of a return to the safe asset shortage economy? Can monetary policy actually stimulate at the zero lower bound on Treasury rates? Well, yes, we believe that quantitative easing is a thing. But with a national debt of with say a 1 percentage point truly duration premium on Treasury bonds, that's swapping $1 trillion of 10-year duration bonds for bills, right? That gets you $10 billion a year of risk-bearing reward compensation taken off of private sector books of banks and other investors. And so $10 billion a year of risk-bearing capacity available to be deployed in providing the risk-bearing capacity to deal with other forms of investment. I don't care how large you think an investment accelerator, that extra $10 billion of private sector risk-bearing capacity available for redeployment is. That's not going to materially move the needle in a 25 trillion or so US economy. That the headline numbers for quantitative easing you have to undertake in order to have a material effect on available risk-bearing capacity in the private sector of the economy are so huge that Bernanke decided, and I believe correctly, that they were simply a non-starter no matter how aggressive he was in the 2010s. Same was true for this time. And is counter-cyclical fiscal policy a live political option in a recession? Well, no, not anymore. Not substantially. You know, it is not George W. Bush or John McCain or Mitt Romney, but Barack Obama, who in January 2010, with the unemployment rate at 10%, would stand up and say that families across the country are tightening their belts and making tough decisions. The Federal Reserve government should be the same. We are prepared to freeze spending for 3 years. And if I have to enforce this discipline by veto, I will. I'm told this came as a great surprise to Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid. A hell of a way to build inter-party comity than to issue a preemptive veto threat to the congressional barons of your party, who you have not communicated with. I have asked people in every single administrative office concerned with economic policy in the Obama administration where this came from and why did nobody, when looking at the State of the Union address, cross it out and say, unfortunately, the private sector has sat down as far as spending is concerned, and it is one of the most basic truths that when the private sector sits down and no longer provides demand to buy the goods produced by American workers, the public sector needs to stand up and fill the gap. I received no even semi-coherent answer, except for Peter Orszag say, well, there was a big asterisk, this was only civilian discretionary spending. And we could do whatever we could get through Congress on the entitlement side and on the national security side. Missing completely that a great many people were going to take their cue from what Barack Obama said. And that his saying there was a spending freeze would be interpreted by an awful lot of people that a spending freeze was the leftmost possibility you could advocate. But no one takes responsibility for actually putting it in. It remains a mystery to me. Under that condition, well, you kind of can understand why the Federal Reserve is unwilling to foreclose any options by moving faster. And yeah, would it have been good for the Fed to have headed it off? You know, what is good? There is a very old Schumpeterian argument that the business cycle is the respiration of a healthy creative destruction economy. And I think on the downside, nearly everyone agrees that in depression this is wrong. That there is no net benefit in terms of accelerating structural adjustment by moving people from a low marginal product activity industry into a zero marginal product activity that is unemployment. But there may be benefits if you think things are relatively myopic to moving people from moderate marginal product activities into high marginal product activities through excess demand, through a high-pressure economy. Janet Yellen, in her academic mode, certainly seems to think so, and to think so powerfully. And then there is a newer Krugmanian argument, you know, that at the zero lower bound, inflation is the only way to get the real market rate of interest to R star, the neutral rate, and so makes Say's law true in practice, even though it is false in theory. But the neutral monetary policy, when you're at zero lower bound, is one that produces substantial inflation. Because matching actual R to R star is the point of the business. Plus the Bewley-esque argument for greasing labor market transitions, given that in society it is a major status insult to cut someone's nominal wage. That would mean that in addition to a natural rate of unemployment, we need to be thinking about a natural rate of inflation. And that natural rate of inflation would depend on the extent of underlying structural change that needs to be allowed to push the economy to a new structural industrial configuration, which it is more than arguable that social learning during the plague years produced. So I think the answer is maybe. Maybe we are ex post in a much better configuration in terms of sectors and industries than we would have been without the inflationary episodes from late 2001 to mid 2003. Would it have been good for the Biden administration to have given dealt the Congress an easier hand to play? Ex post, obviously. Ex ante, really not so clear. If you told Ben Bernanke in 2008 what is coming down the pike, he would have been out there pushing not for the ARRA as it existed in 2009, but for the $2 trillion ARRA that Christina Romer had originally wanted to propose from the CEA. And that it was Larry Summers' judgment that the economic team dared not propose because they asked for something with 12 digits in it. The political and communications people would have thrown them out of the room and never listened to them again. But asking for 900 billion was the most they could ask for and still stay in the room. And there also remains the fact, as Olivier Blanchard pointed out in his AEA presidential address, that when R is less than G, a national debt is indeed a national blessing. It is a profit sector for the fiscal authority and a powerful utility generator for savers as a way of mobilizing the risk-bearing capacity of society through government in a way that private markets are unable to do so. So, on the one hand, probably not. Not until it begins looking like R star is greater than G. Do you have serious business worrying about, what the level of your current deficit is? A deeper answer requires understanding the remaining obscure reasons for the remarkable strength of demand in the U.S. economy over the past 4 years. But then we move from the economics into the politics and into the other great John Maynard Keynes quote about inflation. That Lenin is said to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system is to debauch the currency. That there is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society, because the process of inflation engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction in a manner in which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. Now, Keynes was talking about World War I era and post-World War I era inflation much larger than we saw in the 2020s. But he does have a point, right? Or did have a point then, that inflation, too much money chasing too few goods, it does break the government's macroeconomic management contract, part of which is the economy ought to function so that you can buy what you have planned at the prices you had expected. High unemployment, would high unemployment be preferable? The general glut? Well, high unemployment affects very many fewer people. The long-term unemployed are few. On the other hand, a labor market that is not tight, it is one in which no one dares ask for a raise. And if you don't like the fact that the price of eggs is higher than you expected and you can't buy your entire grocery basket you had planned, you also don't like for the fact that you're so scared of the boss you don't dare ask for a raise. Keynes wants to dodge the question of which to choose, right? That Keynes very much wants to say that both are evils, to be shunned, that a stable measuring rod, full employment without inflation, is what we ask for. But what if you do? Well, right now, Larry Summers is definitely in I told you so mode. That he warned us we would be very sorry for Biden's stimulus and Fed late liftoff. Admittedly, the expectational inflation spiral he expected did not come to pass. That what did happen was something else. Perhaps conclusions by perhaps key voters that a government that could not head off the inflation was not a government worth keeping, was not a competent steward. The fact that the U.S. structure of demand proved stronger and that a different bad consequence came, does not mean that he was wrong to warn of bad consequences. Not wrong ex post, ex ante. Perhaps he is right. I would say probably not. I would really say we owe Jay Powell, his committee, and his staff. They truly did a hell of a job. And we should all be grateful for his judgment. However, Larry is right now, I think, when he warns that the underlying credibility of low inflation expectations is less secure than it was 4 years ago. How close is the precipice? Is there a precipice? We do not know. No, we should worry. And I see Jason Furman's also on the I told you so track, but let me skip that. Because I'm out of time, and say what impresses me is much more a remark by Dean Baker immediately after the election about how the problem is coming from our social media and partisan propaganda in first. That those who understood that violent crime was not unusually high, that inflation by the election day was also not unusually high, that the U.S. stock market was actually quite high in historical perspective, that people who had a sense of what the economic news around them was, they did not break for Trump in massive numbers. It was only those who believed a great many things that were not so who did. A great many people who said, I personally am doing quite fine, but I read on my Facebook and I see on my cable news and streaming that a lot of people in the U.S. are in trouble economically. They were the people who drove for Trump so massively. So conclusions? I'd say applause for the Federal Reserve. I'd say people beating it up right now really are not being responsible judges of the difficulty of the dive and the success. That rather than giving honest scores, they are rather like the East German judges at the Olympics of the bad old days before 1991. Otherwise, the insurance against a return to the zero lower bound from the American Rescue Plan seems to me to be not unjustifiable ex ante. For not everything is the 1970s adaptive expectations inflation spiral, indeed only the 1970s. Yes. On the other hand, it is depressing. We do indeed have a new macroeconomy of regeneration. And with a new structure and new emergent properties, not one we can accurately model. And yet somehow the concerns of, say, Malthus and Mill trying to understand the emergence of a new industrial economy with a macroeconomics in the first quarter of the 1800s, they do somehow remain strikingly relevant for us today. And that's all I got. Thank you very much.
It's only that. And they're not here to help.
All right.
Sorry.
Well, we can speak loudly.
Yes, so we'll get a few questions, and but if you can say your name and then we'll collect 5 questions or so, and then we can come back.
Nicholas Tiedemann, you've stressed the thanks that we owe the Fed, and you've mentioned, but haven't said much about Biden and Congress. It seems to me that the stimulus involved a lot of unnecessary gifts to rich people, and we could have had less inflation if we had made some of those loans and not been so generous. Would that have been possible, or did the Republicans insist on that as a condition of anything? I don't know I don't know the politics of it.
We've got a few.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, well, I'm delighted to see that you think that the old adaptive expectations inflation spiral is historically specific and we've moved past it. But it seems to me that the whole conversation about monetary policy has failed to catch up. Monetary policy is organized around the Taylor rule. And the Taylor rule is based on this idea that you basically need to create a recession in order to stabilize inflation. That is no longer true. It's clearly no longer true because we just experienced a massive